So we're really delighted, before we go to our break, to have our final speaker for the first half of the morning. Ruth Little is an internationally renowned dramaturg. She's been the literary manager at Out of Joint, the Soho Theatre, the Young Vic, the Royal Court. She's working with Akram Khan Dance Company at the moment. We're very lucky and honoured to have Ruth with us in Fishamble for the past year and on an ongoing basis as an advisor, talking to her about our new play clinic and the various schemes and initiatives we run for writers and how we can develop and improve on those. She's a mine of information, and we're delighted she's here. So I'll pass you over now to Ruth, who's going to have a short 15-minute conversation with Gavin. Thanks very much.
You say this side. Or would you prefer that? Well,
there is actually a second microphone that's useful.
Should I do that? You can just get yourself.
Fine.
Okay, is that going to work?
That's fine by me.
Is that going to work? Oh yeah, great. Fantastic. This is great to be in, and thank you very much for coming, Ruth. It's part of a year-long engagement with Ruth, between ourselves and Ruth, Fishamble and Ruth.
Which mostly involves me just sort of coasting around in Dublin. I have to say the idea of me giving advice to you is sort of ridiculous, because I just absorb a huge amount of information. This man speaks more quickly than anyone I have ever met in my life. That was not a 15-minute talk, that was a half-hour talk compressed into 15 minutes. So I always go away from, and actually you're not much better, Jim, I always go away from Fishamble encounters with this buzzing in my head. It's incredibly rich.
Well, to return the compliment, Ruth, if it was a compliment, as you know, Ruth, I spend most of my life on the streets, and what I listen to is the word on the streets. That is pretty much what I do. And for about 2 weeks there, all I heard was people bending my ear about Giselle. They go, fucking Giselle, you know. But gosh, this is just astonishing. Now, Ruth will be joining us in the afternoon for the panel discussion. So in terms of prioritising the art and enjoying ourselves a bit, for now, I just really want to talk to Ruth about dance and dramaturgy and dance development. That whole area that's really opened up. Is great to see in the ITI presentation, new variations of theatre coming into being. And if we just take it nice and slow, actually, Ruth, for everyone, Giselle itself is one of the early ballets, I gather. So you're working with Akram Khan. Who decided to look at that? What happened at the very origins of that, if you would?
Sure. Don't ask me about the history of Giselle or anything to do with classical ballet, because that is not my background. And it wasn't the background of anyone who was involved as creative team in that production. English National Ballet approached Akram. I think Tamara Roja, who's the artistic director there, is visionary in her understanding that the classical world, for all its strength and beauty and resilience, also needs to connect with and communicate with the world of contemporary dance, but also with the contemporary world beyond contemporary dance as well. And so I think we're all interested in stories, in storytelling. Akram is a consummate storyteller, even in work that has no text. And that's so interesting to hear the focus on text today, because that's my background too. But I actually increasingly work with writers in a very different way. They are at the centre of the process, but they aren't necessarily visible at the centre of the process. And so there are many ways, I think, of working with text and language and as a form of communication among other forms of communication. And Giselle, we approached in a similar way, because there is a complex story with Giselle. Tamara wanted to produce it because the ENB was doing a production of what's known as their sort of the traditional version of the piece by Mary Skeeping, and she wanted to sit it alongside a contemporary adaptation by Akram. So he'd worked briefly on a short piece with English National Ballet, but he'd never done a full-length ballet. None of us had done a full-length ballet. It was a whole new world. And the first thing that we had to do was come to terms with the rather ridiculous story of the original ballet. We all went away and we watched countless versions of it, and we came together sort of scratching our heads going, oh my God, is it really true that we have to tell a story in which the peasants, the world of Giselle is divided into two halves, the realm of the aristocrats, who are the landowners and the controllers of the space and the people, and the world of the peasants, who are happy, bucolic, romantic, endlessly dancing and grape-picking servants to the aristocrats. And so it was very difficult to come straight in there and say, well, we're going to repeat this story. We couldn't repeat that story. We had to put ourselves in conflict with that story in order to find out how it might resonate.
Ooh, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
Well, yeah. I've once come across people who say, yeah, there's the play. We need to problematize the play. So a bit of me's going, really? You need to make a problem? It's hard enough to get people to focus in the first place.
Yeah.
So, but you're saying here that kind of thing. You needed to make that play
We were
story a
banging
problem.
our heads against it but in a way, in a simple way, and ultimately a really productive way. You can't make anything without chafing against something. That is how everything comes into being. And so, the limitations around the concept are also what leads you through it into the new work. So we were banging our heads against this idea of the working poor as stable, happily settled. In all of the productions of Giselle, they live in whitewashed houses with roses growing around the doorway. You think, whose house is that? Who lives in that house in the 21st century? Who lived in it in medieval Germany, for crying out loud? So we started to look at the conditions of the working poor in the world. It happened to be alongside the initial period of the migration crisis that was developing across Europe through Greece. And it sat in the context of the fact that the production was opening in Manchester, which of course is a city that was abandoned after the Industrial Revolution in economic terms, as the great global tide of capital flooded out of Manchester and its fabric trade and went into Bangladesh and built up its fabric trade. And so we found ourselves with all sorts of conditions that we could explore, and the main condition that we understood from our time, as opposed to the time of the original production, was mobility, the movement of human bodies in search of work and away from or following the tides of capital as they slosh back and forward independently of our lives and desires and ambitions. So we started to look at mobility and movement and homelessness and landlessness and as the conditions of the working poor in our time. And as soon as you do that, you create a new lens and a new language. And suddenly the original story isn't an issue anymore. And in fact, it was a delight to be able to work with the structure of the original adaptation. I think is a fantastic opportunity for artists, especially artists who are blocked in some way, because you could settle into the form and the structure of the story, but bring your own intentions and imagery and metaphors to it.
Can I is it in parallel or is it separate? Can I bring in the physical body of the dancer at that point? Because this, that's a conversation, and it's fascinating. You're looking at the work, but at the same time, there are people who are going to physically move to make this work and embody it. So how does that track come in?
Well, again, you're working with limitations and seeing those as opportunities. The limitation, if you like, was the classically trained bodies of the dancers and the fact that they understood Giselle in bodily terms, embodied terms, far better than we did, but we were bringing new impulses towards it. And so the work that Akram had to do was, in light of the decisions that we'd made about reconstructing it as a story of power expressed through control of bodies and the movement of bodies and the expulsion of bodies from places and spaces. Akram had to work with those classical bodies which are trained to work vertically, to train to work against gravity, and to train to work with virtuosity. And in a sense, we unpicked all of those things and began to look at the role of gravity, the role of industrialized labor on bodies, because we were positing that our landless poor were workers in the garment industry. And so we wanted to explore repetition and regulation in bodily form as well.
My good friend Steve Daunt, who's a leading disabled rights activist, talks about this, and he talks about O'Casey being the finest writer for disability that Ireland's ever produced. If you think of the shattering effect of the First World War and the incorporation to that, when I think about those things, and the Manchester Looms, one always thinks about disability and the loss, physical loss. Did you think about that as well?
We thought a lot about the uses and the abuses of bodies, and that follows into the second half of Giselle, which takes place in a sort of realm of death, where all of the women in the original who have been betrayed by their lovers and died of broken hearts, as women do, gather together under the ministrations of a rather angrier version of their dead selves, who turns them as a tool of retribution against the luckless men who come upon them. So they're called the willies, which is always a ridiculous thing to have to call them. There's so many ridiculous things about classical ballet, and yet it is astonishingly, fantastically beautiful and strong and vital and vibrant. I don't mean to diss it at all, because we gained so much understanding of strength and discipline and coordination and complex forms of movement from the dancers, but we also had to push them to become, if you like, objects of these industrial processes. So one of the things that Akram did, just to finish your question, in the original, the dancers are on point for much of the work, and certainly for the second part. He kept them on point, which is the most ridiculous form of motion you can imagine. It's like having bound feet. That's exactly what we wanted from it. We wanted that experience of constraint and abuse of bodily form. And so you simply take one and you place it in another context, and it produces this incredible dynamic. It's a very powerful scene.
I believe in the Russian history of ballet, the original ballet dancers were serfs. They were actually serf slaves. So that abuse of the ballet dancer, you know, the teacher is aristocrat and the ballet dancer is the body to be abused and used for 20 years and then thrown away.
Oh yeah, I mean, they spend their lives in ice baths and things, the poor ones. They've got joints that are falling apart, and it's incredibly...
I was very pleased, though, to hear you there start to talk about beauty, because, I mean, if you make a mental link, those who didn't see Giselle, but maybe something like Swan Lake, everything you're talking about is there, and yet at the same time people talk away about coming, like, not being able to put it into words, a feeling of like, something beyond, something transcendent happened. Is that just something that, you know, happens through the body? We go through the body for a yearning for another place and somehow it happens, or do you actually talk about those kind of notions as well?
Well, I mean, my feeling is, and this comes from working in dance, I've learnt more about working in theatre by going away from it and working in dance and then coming back to it than I think I learnt in the 15 years that I was just working full-time in theatre. But that's to do with my interest and my tendency, but also my sense that theatre, whatever form it takes, or live art, whatever form it takes, is about movement, is about motion. And for me, language and text are gestural capacities that we communicate in order to bring about change. And that change becomes visible at every level of scale when you focus down your attention within a dramatic work or a dance work. So movement is, I mean, Peter Brook said it himself too, everything begins with movement. Anne Bogart says it, I wait until there's movement and then I begin to swim. If you start to think about language as a form of movement that brings about change, then you don't have to create a sort of a somewhat artificial distinction between how we speak and why we speak, and what we bring about by speaking and moving. And we are moved. Everything is about movement in theatre. So for me, dramaturgy is to do with what moves in space and time, where it moves to, that's the narrative structure of things, and how we are moved by it, which is the evocative structure of it.
I think it's great. I'm just aware of time because this is conversational mode, sorry, but we'll have more time with Ruth in the afternoon, and you can pick her up, and anyone else, the speakers then. Just very briefly to give you a chance, Xenos, so there's a whole new production just opened up in London, I think.
It's about to come to Sadler's Wells.
So Akram Khan's last piece in which he dances, apparently.
Yes, it's his last full-length solo piece.
Tell us a little bit about 2 minutes on that.
But again, going back to the body, it's commissioned by the 1418 now, a festival of work that commemorates the 100th years of the First World War. Akram was commissioned to make a work about the First World War, and he chose to consider the experience of a Bangladeshi soldier, a colonial soldier. There were over 1.4 million soldiers from India who fought in the First World War. It's only in the last 2 or 3 years that their contribution and their suffering has really been considered and explored and pulled up out of the archives. It's in the archives, it was held down in the archives. So we began that piece by thinking about the body itself as a form of archive, which holds the histories of its own abuses and its own traditions. And Akram is a Kathak dancer, so he carried that Kathak tradition with him into the piece and, in a sense, into the war.
Give us Kathak dancer.
Sorry? Oh, Kathak is a classical form in India, one of the main classical forms alongside Bharatanatyam. It's a form of storytelling. Kathak means story. And Kathak dancers were dancers who travelled around the courts in India, telling stories mostly from the Mahabharata and the great mythological texts. So at the heart of Kathak is the communication of story through very precise movement, language and gesture. And we explored a world that was being industrially disassembled during the First World War, and that meant that culture was disassembled too. So we wanted to look at, if you like, the unmaking of the traditional body, the flinging of that body out into the estranging circumstances of the trenches and the battlefields of the First World War. So it's very much a piece about estrangement. That flows through not just into the body language, but also the text. And there is a text for this piece written by the Canadian playwright Jordan Tannehill. A lot of that text was created. It became a form of orientation for us, movement-wise, and then it got reabsorbed into the piece. So only about 15% of the text is still there. It's the concentrated essence of the conversations and the emotional experience of that figure, that individual lone figure in the trenches, facing industrial form of exploitation. That seems to be all we ever make work about, industrial exploitation.
Yeah. What about the workers? That's what I say. Great. Thank you so much, Ruth. Are we happy to take a brief coffee break there? And we'll tell you when to come back in 15 minutes.